Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, all the twists and turns surrounding the firing of former MSU football coach Mel Tucker. He is accused of sexual harassment involving a sexual assault survivor. And while the Tucker case is grabbing the headlines, the reality is incidents and investigations involving sexual assault and sexual misconduct on college campuses is not new at Michigan State and elsewhere for that matter. So tonight we have two university professors who are also lawyers, by the way, who will discuss, among other things, the Title IX implications. That's the civil rights law that's designed to protect people from discrimination on the basis of sex in education programs and activities like sports. But first, we would like to hear from you, our viewers, to help drive the conversation here on the show. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media on Facebook or dialing into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. If you're watching on YouTube, please leave a comment. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows, you can click on our website at deltacollegepublicmedia.org. And with that, our two guests in studio, we have Dr. Kyla Stepp. She's an associate professor with Central Michigan University School of Politics, Society, Justice, and Public Service. Also does some a pre-law advisor. So thank you. Your first time here.
Thank you.
And we have a regular here, Julie Keil. She is a political science professor at Saginaw Valley State University, board chair this year. And as I said, they're both attorneys, which will be impactful for our discussion tonight. So just to be clear to the viewers, as lawyers, we're not trying the Mel Tucker case.
No.
Far from it. But what we are going to do is have you guys talk about some of the allegations of the sexual misconduct that have come up in this Mel Tucker case, and also maybe take a look at some of the laws that are governing this kind of behavior, particularly Title IX and some other things. Lots to unpack here. So let's start with Title IX. Can we define it? Kind of what is it? What's it designed to do, Julie?
Well, you basically described it already. It was an act that was passed, I believe, in 1972 or sometime in the early 1970s, in order to try to eliminate the discrimination against women and men as well, occasionally, but primarily with women, to try to put a little more equality between the sexes. And so I was actually a recipient of Title IX because I was able to do women's sports for the first time in high school, which they never had before. So that was my original introduction to Title IX. The Title IX things that I do now, though, involve sexual misconduct on campus. So I've been working on getting trained to be able to notice those problems, be able to deal with them, and be able to report them, have investigations done on it on my local campus.
So there is a Title IX investigation at MSU. It's currently underway in the case of Mel Tucker because of his alleged behavior. But is it applying in this case, do you think?
I personally don't think it is, because it's not a case that involves a faculty member or somebody or a person that's part of an educational program on campus. And I know there's an allegation, since she's a vendor, that in some way makes her part of it. But I don't really think it fits within the Title IX jurisdiction. I could be wrong, but that's my understanding of it.
Because when you look at his contract, certainly Title IX applies to not only him, but professors and other people within the university.
Well, if he did that exact same actions with one of his students or one of his football players, clearly that would fall under Title IX, because it interferes with their educational opportunities. And Title IX, basically, for the educational side of it, is designed to make sure that people don't get put in situations which impair their ability to get an education, whether K-12 or whether it's college or if you're graduate school. But in this particular case, the person that's involved in it is not actually a person that's attending the campus classes. It's not part of an educational program in any way, shape, or form. She simply provides vending services to it. So she's a inspirational speaker that comes in and provides, speaking. So I don't know that Title IX actually fits with this particular type of case.
Okay, we'll talk more about that the longer we go into the discussion tonight. So for the basis of our next phase of this discussion, I want to show the viewers kind of MSU side of things and Mel Tucker's side of things in terms of the attorney. So we have a graphic, and this is, we're talking about MSU Athletic Director Alan Haller, and the reason he fired former MSU football coach Mel Tucker. There it is on your screen. It is decidedly unprofessional and unethical to flirt, make sexual comments, and have phone sex with a university vendor, which Mel Tucker admitted. In doing so, Tucker violated the moral turpitude clause in his contract, which mandates that he, Tucker, conduct himself professionally and ethically with integrity and sportsmanship at all time. On the counter side, Jennifer Belville, attorney for Mel Tucker, says this: MSU lacked the jurisdiction to investigate his private life. Furthermore, Tucker did not breach his contractual agreement or engage in any unprofessional or unethical conduct in any stretch of the imagination. This is nothing more than the school's knee-jerk reaction to national media reports. And again, we're talking about allegations made by a Brenda Tracy, who was a sexual assault advocate survivor that Mel Tucker had invited to the school to talk to his team. And in fact, she's been around a lot of college campuses. I think she actually talked to the Michigan football team too. Very high profile. And then at some point, there was more of a personal relationship between she and Mel Tucker, and I think that's debatable. So this is where the case against Mel sort of gets muddier, and Kyla, maybe you can help us with this, because he did have a morals clause in his contract with MSU, and while he says MSU has no right to fire him for what he does in his private life, his contract says otherwise. You want to go down that path?
Sure. So the moral turpitude clause of his contract, Michigan State is saying he violated that when he engaged in this conduct, whether it amounts to sexual harassment or not. Just the conduct itself is enough to violate the moral turpitude clause, that he has embarrassed Michigan State with this matter, and that's enough to be able to fire him for cause. And of course, the for cause is important because that means they don't have to pay out the rest of his contract. And so he's arguing, no, this was in my personal life. You know, where do we draw the line? Is so-called phone sex, is that in itself immoral? Does that violate the clause, even if it happened between two consenting adults, which is, of course, up for debate and something that the investigator is trying to determine. So, yeah, we have this issue, kind of this vague word of moral turpitude. Is what he did immoral enough, violate the contract, or not? Is it part of his private life that the school should stay out of? So a very interesting interpretation. We have to interpret the word moral here.
Right, and whether it was consensual or not, which is what he claims, probably doesn't matter given the fact you've got this clause, and it probably applies to not just coaches, but it applies probably to academic advisors, department heads. You guys are both in academia. Are those contracts that you guys have to abide by?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We would be punished for it as well. The interesting question being whether or not the fact that it was not actually an employee, a student, somebody who was engaged in the educational program that was there, that was involved in it with him. That does make it a little bit of a different situation, but certainly if I engaged in moral turpitude against a stranger who happened to be on campus or happened to be in some way related to it, that would definitely be a problem with my contract as well.
It's interesting because had she been somebody, let's say anonymous, that wasn't sort of a public figure, I'm not sure she was necessarily, but certainly she was a vendor who was a sexual assault advocate survivor. People knew who she was. They knew what her initiative was. She was going around the country, and the fact that it involved her, had it been somebody more anonymous, somebody that wasn't as a high profile, it still would have been wrong behavior, if indeed this is true, but I'm wondering if it raised to the level of where we're at today.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is about interpreting kind of that moral turpitude, and certainly I think that factors into it, just like the fact that he was on a work trip, right? MSU was paying for the hotel. He was there on behalf of MSU. It's not that he was in the off-season at home making this phone call. So there's all of these different factors to consider who she was. She was invited by him in the first place. She had, at least according to her allegations, turned him down several times before this. He continued to pursue her, allegedly, and him knowing who she is and is still engaged in this kind of behavior certainly is part of MSU's calculation that this does, in fact, violate his contract.
Sure.
Yeah, I think there's I agree with Kyla on that. I think that the turpitude part of it becomes even more critical when you have something you know has had past history of being sexually abused. and you take advantage of that and then engage in behavior that you should know, any person over the age of 12 should know that probably that would be inappropriate behavior to do with somebody who's in that situation and is not consenting to it. Just makes it so that it's not just an average anonymous phone sex call that someone might make to a friend or whatever. He has to know what her situation is and chose to take those actions anyway, which shows extremely poor judgment on his part.
Yeah, very much so. And some of this is allegations, but some of it he has admitted to, which I think led to his firing. On the private life issue again, Mel Tucker's attorney, Jennifer Belville, said they'd hired an expert witness to look at this case on Mel's behalf, a Brett Socolow, who co-founded and serves as the board chair of the Association of Title IX Administrators, which is a professional organization for school officials. You're familiar with it.
Yes.
So he claims, after his investigation, MSU should drop this case against Tucker, saying, okay, can an employee never have phone sex? Can they view pornography? Can they have an extramarital affair? How far can MSU, or any other college for that matter, go to police the private lives of their employees? So you want to run with that?
I think that Mel Tucker is a different type of employee than we a lot of times will see in these cases. He is arguably the most high-profile employee at Michigan State, a public figure. So I think that that makes him subject to different standards than the rest of us. I mean, he's still subject to the same standards as any employee, but to a higher level. That's why he has that moral turpitude clause in his contract, because Michigan State knows that he is a public figure, and if he does something, it could embarrass the university, and Michigan State has been through very recent tumultuous times. So I don't think we can kind of equate him to your average everyday employee.
Yeah, the Larry Nassar case, which we will never forget. They just sort of wrap that up, although there's still some lawsuits related to it, and for this to happen, it's just awful, the circumstances. So back to what you said originally, because Kyla was talking a little bit about, do you think he was fired more because he broke the sort of moral turpitude clause, or you don't think it's a Title IX at all, right?
I don't believe it's a Title IX because I don't think that Title IX has jurisdiction. And the way the case is being handled does not appear to be a Title IX case either, because there would be completely different. They wouldn't be having attorneys, they'd be having advisors. Because the Title IX process itself involves you can have an attorney as your advisor, but that person has a completely different role than what they're talking about with the advisors in this case.
Right.
So I don't believe it is a Title IX. I know they keep on talking about it because it was from the Title IX office, but that's where cases involving sexual issues happen, and then they're put into different spots. So some are involved in contractual problems. Some are put into an area where student conduct is involved. Some are put in the area where employee conduct is involved. So just because it's being heard in the Title IX office, I don't believe this is a Title IX case. Okay. I could be wrong, so if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. But I don't think it actually is because I don't see where there's jurisdiction.
So Kyla, we kind of brought that up that Mel Tucker is certainly a high-profile coach. Mm-hmm. The alleged victim in this case is also high-profile. Mm-hmm. Do you think this MSU treated it any differently? In some cases, had this just been an anonymous person that Mel Tucker may have taken advantage of, it's still wrong, the behavior's wrong, mm-hmm. but the fact that she was high-profile, he's high-profile, do you think they handled it any differently? Maybe didn't suspend right away, waited a few months mm-hmm. before it hit sort of the national media in the last 3 weeks, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting because, it's hard to speculate, but the athletic director knew about this right back in December. The Board of Trustees knew about this a while ago as well, even if they didn't, or at least they alleged they didn't know her identity until more recently. But waiting to suspend until it hit the news the same day, it's interesting. I think they would have handled it differently if it hadn't been Mel Tucker, if it had been some other employee of the university. But then again, it wouldn't have been the subject of a USA Today special report had it been some other employee of the university. So I don't know. I think it's interesting to see how they've handled it, and I'm sure that Larry Nassar and some of these other scandals are very fresh in their mind.
Sure.
Some of, whether they handle this well or not, that will play out in Mel Tucker's, I'm sure, inevitable wrongful termination suit. So we'll get to see this all played out at some point in the future.
Yeah, on that note, so the timing of this show, the reason I wanted you guys to come on and talk about this, because this hearing, actually, mm-hmm. it's a 2-day hearing. I think it begins tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And it'll feature Mel Tucker, his attorney, MSU, and probably a third-party investigator.
Mm-hmm. If he shows up. Mel Tucker has indicated he may not, in fact, go, and he doesn't have to. So
well,
that's one of the interesting things to look
and
for.
until they fired him, it was supposed to be the outcome of this hearing over the next couple of days that would then, okay, now we'll take a lot of it. They sort of said, no, we've seen enough. So I wonder why they even need this hearing.
Because they need to terminate him so that they can then start the process to be able to show that they had a reason to be able to terminate him, which then makes his lawsuit to be able for wrongful termination more difficult.
Right.
So they've had a hearing, they've had an objective decision maker that comes and listens to the hearing, makes a decision, the decision upholds what Michigan State chose to do. It will help in the wrongful termination case.
They also need to follow through on the original complaint, right? The complaint was still made, so even if he's not employed right now, he was employed at the time, they need to follow through, have an investigation, have a final result, to show that they can follow through on these. They're not just going to kind of drop it. So, yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this, if anything. You know, they might just make a statement about the results. But, yeah, certainly it will help their case in the upcoming wrongful termination suit, but also just to show that they do follow through on these complaints. They can't just dismiss it at this point.
Also under the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, you're required to follow through all these steps. There's been these sort of allegations made. Even if you decide there's no reason for the allegations and you dismiss it, you're required to have an investigation and have a determination be made. So they would be getting in trouble with the OCR, which is a federal agency, if they did not follow through with it and finish it off.
So back to Title IX and your expertise, and I think you and I have talked before that you were a swimmer in high school back in the early 70s, right, when Title IX first was enacted, but it paved the way for more women's sports, right? And you benefited from that.
I did. It was the first time they had world sports other than cheerleading and pom-pom, which back then were not considered to be sports. They are now, but they weren't considered to be back then. Actually, the first time high schools then allowed girls to be involved in sports.
So now how many years later, 50, I'll do my math, 50, 60 years later, what has been sort of the benefit of that? I know if you look at statistics, a lot more women are participating in sports at a high level, which is great. But when it comes to, you dispute that. Okay, go ahead.
Well, a lot more women are being involved in sports. The problem is women's sports are still thought as being second-class sports. With the exception maybe the women's gymnastics team, which is doing amazingly well right now as opposed to the men. So that may be a bit of a difference. Gymnastics is kind of its own thing. But if you, and again, I get these things every day from the TICS and the other groups, and one of the big things that's been happening recently is looking at the inequality between sporting opportunities for women versus men. So if you have sports you allow and you give scholarships, you're required to get the same amount of scholarships, same amount of slots for the same sports within the university, and virtually nobody does that because it's just easier to find men's sports than it is to find women's sports. Women's sports are often more expensive because they have to travel further for competitions. Men can compete at Northwood. Women may have to go down to Lansing to be able to compete. So there's a lot of inequalities that are still happening in women's sports.
So when you look at the benefits, and if you look at it, and where I was going with that is, are universities by and large doing a good job of investigating these fully, or are they sweeping it under the rug? In this case, we did just talk briefly about MSU has to have this hearing over the next couple of days, do their due diligence, make sure that it's fully investigated, because the eyes of the world are watching. But based on your experience, have schools in general, have they been good at this, or have they wiped it under the rug?
File a disclaimer here and say I'm not talking about my university I work for at all,
right?
Or Central Michigan, which I attended. So I mean, I know nothing about specifics about schools in this area. I do know that there has been a group, and I can't remember the name of the group, but has recently been going out and filing complaints against a number of universities in the country, claiming inequality between women's and men's sports, and pointing out those very clear distinctions. I've probably read 10 or 12 of those cases in the last month because this group's become very active. So it's definitely hitting the interest of people again, finally.
Well, maybe it's just a perception. For me to say that you see a lot more headlines of after the fact, they didn't investigate, he did it again. And the schools sort of get a black eye a little bit by not fully investigating, sort of related to Me Too kind of thing.
It's more than a black eye. They actually get cited and they're forced to not make reparations, but they're forced to make changes in their policies and in their programs and comply with them, and then have an investigator come in again to look to make sure that they're actually following those things. It's actually a pretty big deal to have the OCR go after you. So, but there's only so much they can do.
Yeah. At both of your universities, I know you're kind of in the front lines of Title IX. You certainly have.
I'm on the committee. That's it. Yeah.
Okay, that counts. And in your role in political science and law, are sort of Title IX sexual misconduct issues, is it brought front and center to the students? Do you talk about it? Do you talk about it in classes? Is it front and center? Do they talk about prevention? All of this that happens. Is it out there, I guess? Yeah.
I think it's out there. I think that not just my university, but most universities could probably do a better job of making sure students are aware of their rights and where they can go. I make sure that my students are well aware of that, and certainly the training that all the employees get focuses very heavily on our role in that. But again, there could always be more information and more for students to rely on.
And we offer training to our students also. Problem with it is professors, you can kind of make them take the training. Students, it's really hard to make them take the training. So, and I just watched a statistic on this recently. Faculty members, probably 75% of them at least watch the training. Adjuncts, maybe 40%. Students, maybe 20%. So they get a training at fresh start when they first come to college and whatever. But beyond that, we really can't force them to continue to do training. The exception to that is the athletes, because they can make the athletes do it. So they're around 90% compliance with the athletes because they're forced to do it, and for good reasons. And I think that's helpful, but we could do better with it as well. I think it's still ways to go.
So in your experience, in your role at SVSU, are you seeing more cases, allegations made related to athletics, academics? Is it even? Do athletics seem to get more attention because they're high-profile athletics?
If you're talking about for Title IX, I can't tell you because I don't know, because we don't actually publish statistics on it that I have available, and I don't think I don't think there are a lot of cases, but I don't want to. Again, it's my university. I'm not speaking for the university,
Sure.
So I don't want to be putting my foot in my mouth here. So be careful on that.
Can you at least talk maybe about the process, how it works?
Well, the process itself is fairly simple. Everybody that works at Saginaw Valley is a mandated reporter, with a few exceptions. So if somebody comes to you and notes the fact that there was a sexual harassment or an assault or whatever occurred, you're required to then contact the Title IX coordinator, who then takes the notice from that, files a notice of interest on it, and then takes actions. They can investigate, they can suspend, they can force people to have no contact order, they can do whatever they need to do to make it work. But then the process happens. The process itself takes a while because they do a lot of investigation. They talk to all kinds of people. If it continues on with being upheld that there is reasons to be concerned, then they have a hearing on it.
Okay. Well, along that lines, and sort of related to the Mel Tucker case, I mean, what happens all the time in cases we're dealing with sexual misconduct, people are suspended all the time before all the facts are investigated fully. You're kind of in a no-win situation if you're a college campus, because you've got this allegation, it's pretty serious, and it's taken some time, but you got to put the person out of play a little bit, right?
Actually, not really so much.
Okay, go ahead.
Not really so much, because we have alternatives we can do. No contact orders will require the people to have no contact with each other. We can force one of the parties to move into a different dormitory. We can have students separate out in different classes. We can provide accommodations for them to have online classes so they don't lose their education. There's a lot of things you can do with those supportive measures that don't involve just simply suspending somebody or ignoring it.
Okay.
There's a wealth of things we can actually do. And we do.
Go ahead.
And we do those things.
So in some cases, these allegations may be unfounded, but you don't know it until the facts come out. And so there are sometimes, okay, whatever you're going to do, we've got to keep them apart. And sometimes it might be unfair to the person that might be accused, who might be innocent. We see how it plays out. So I think in those cases, it's a move to sort of ensure the rights of the alleged victim in this case, as opposed to happening over and over again.
We're required to look at the rights of both sides. So we can't just simply suspend people without a really good reason why other things can't be done.
Yeah.
And we try very hard to make sure that everybody is heard and everybody has a chance to continue their education. It's difficult sometimes. And some people you do, for something like also a criminal complaint or something that may be more serious, they may take other actions. But there's a lot of intermediate steps that you can do that'll provide some security for the campus.
And we went down that path a little bit, but in Mel Tucker's case, again, it seems like the university knew more and waited for a while. Kind of a no-win situation. And I think they're being sort of accused of, why did you do something sooner? And it's easier said than done when you're athletic director and your board. One other area that I'll touch on, if you're a sports fan, someone said that, well, the board kind of was quick to sign Mel Tucker to this large $100 million contract, and he'd only been there 2 years. And in the last year, he didn't have that good of a year, and there were some thinking, well, it wasn't going in a good direction, so this is, yes, his behavior was not good, so this kind of gives us an out, and they can save $80 million. Any thoughts on that? I don't know if you're a sports fan or a football fan.
Yes, I'm a very big sports fan.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cynical way to look at it, but the world's a cynical place. So it's hard to know what's in their heads. I mean, it's certainly possible. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, Mel Tucker's attorney asked for the university to save all documentation, all communication, all correspondence from his time there. So again, in his inevitable lawsuit, I'm sure that we'll see all correspondence, see if there's any indication if people were, dumb enough to write down those thoughts.
Right.
I'm sure they'll come to light. So maybe we'll never know, but yeah, I mean, certainly it's possible.
I don't think you'll ever have them say that. I think they probably have enough evidence to go in that direction. But Bob, if you throw up that graphic one more time about Mel Tucker and how long he's been there and how much is he worth as we're sort of talking about that. There it is. So he was the 6th highest paid college coach entering the 2023 season, $9.5 million a year. So that's just kind of what we talked about. So do you think this hearing in the next couple of days, is it going to change anything in his wrongful termination suit? Is it something that state will say, boy, let's make this go away, we'll cut you a check, but not for $80 million?
Right.
If you're I know you're not a judge, but any thoughts the way this might play out with our about 50 seconds left?
Yeah, the hearing isn't public, so we theoretically won't know much about what goes on, and it will know the result at some point. I'm sure that if it turns out in Michigan State's favor, so to speak, the allegations are founded, then that will help their case. However, they fired him before this hearing takes place, so they'll still have to contend with that a little bit. I can't imagine they'll try to pay him off at this point, now with what happened with Larry Nassar, but you never know. We'll see.
Well, that's the last word on that. Great having you both in. Good discussion.
Great coming.
Yeah,
Time went really fast, like it always does. And that's our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next week for the follow-up. We will focus on a tax cut lawsuit against state officials, claiming the state is holding on to more of our tax dollars in violation of state law. That's next week on the follow-up. Hope to see you then. Have a good night.